This is December 8th, 2018, and we're filming with Dr. Debbie Reese at the Pueblo Cultural Center in Pewaukee, New Mexico. In the room are Dr. Reese, Dr. Beverly Singer, our videographer and documentarian, and Rose Diaz, the IPCC project coordinator. Good morning.
Good morning.
Dr. Debbie Reese is a tribally enrolled member at Nambe Pueblo in northern New Mexico. The daughter of George and Andrenita Yates, the couple raised 5 children in the upper village near the grandparents. She enjoys teaching and has taught in elementary and public schools, as well as teaching in boarding schools in Anadarko, Oklahoma, and at the Santa Fe Indian School in Santa Fe, New Mexico. As a former assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, she taught children's literature, social studies methods, the politics of children's literature, intro to American Indian studies, and the history of American Indian education. On campus, she served as the first director of the American Indian Studies program and was involved in the removal of the controversial mascot Chief Illiniwek in 2007. Since 2006, she has successfully maintained the American Indian in Children's Literature blog, an influential voice for publishers, writers, and teachers addressing the stereotypical depictions of American Indians. Welcome and thank you for joining us today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
I'd like to start by asking about your growing up years in Nambe Pueblo.
All right.
What you remember, grandparents, relationships.
Oh, lots of stories.
Good.
Lots of stories that are the kinds of stories that I'd like kids to see in children's books, and including butchering, things that we do that are part of who we are, taking care of meat when the guys go hunting and they come back with a deer. All of those are parts of the things that mattered to me a lot when I was growing up, and learning dances in the kiva and being in the kiva and listening to elders talk there about what we do and who we are and what we talk about and what we don't talk about. I went to the day school in first grade there at the same day school that my dad went to and that my grandmother went to. I think my grandmother was in one of the first classes that they had there when it got started in the late 1800s. So I went to that same day school, and I really liked school. I enjoyed reading and learning to read and doing all the things you do when you're a little kid in school. I remember the books that I learned to read in, and some of them were in those deep, dark recesses of my mind until I was an adult, and I came across one in particular. It's called Tip. Tip and Mitten. It's a Basil Reader, and I saw that, and I was like, my breath caught, because I thought, oh, that's that book. I learned to read in that book. And I've since studied that book, and another one that I read at the end of the school year, because I really did do well in school, and there was an end of the year school assembly, and the teacher and librarian wanted me to recite a book at the end of the school year. And this was 1964, and the book that they wanted me to recite is called Little Owl Indian. And that was in the back of my mind until I was teaching at the University of Illinois, teaching a children's literature course there, and students brought in books from home, and somebody brought that book in, and I was stunned because I knew that book. As soon as I looked at it, I knew it. But I was horrified at it because Little Owl Indian was pink as he could be. And he was doing this, and he was doing this, and he was doing all these stereotypical things, and I thought, wow, times have really changed in some ways. I would like to think that teachers in the Indian schools today are not handing books like that to kids in the schools. But anyway, growing up there at the reservation, going to the day school there, getting in trouble, hanging out with cousins, and doing all kinds of things that you do. You just run around.
You live close to your grandparents?
Yeah, our house was kind of an L-shaped when we were little, and my grandma's was part of that L. So my dad built our house attached to her house. And I was the first of 5, and I was very close to my grandmother, and I really just went to stay with her in her house a lot. So I slept in her house a lot with her and my grandfather. She had a wood stove. She was a very strong person in lots of ways, and she took good care of me. She wouldn't let me get out of bed in the morning until she started the fire in her wood stove, and she'd make toast for me on that wood stove. And she had a little copper bottom pot, 1 cup measuring cup, that I didn't know that's what it was at the time, but she made oatmeal for me in that little. Lots of warm memories of my grandmother and grandfather.
You talk quite a bit about your father as a major influence in your life in everything that I've read. Can you tell us about him and his accomplishments? I
Sure.
was just blown away by the things that he has accomplished.
Yeah, my dad did a lot, and he is a key figure in my own ways of being a person in the world, because my dad was no nonsense. Native people deserve just the same things that everybody else gets. And so he worked at the lab, and he was a physicist without a PhD, developing science and cameras that were of that kind that PhDs do. But he didn't have a PhD. He went to night school every year when we were kids, taking general education courses at UNM, and so he was doing homework for his UNM courses, and we were doing homework for our own school homework, and we graduated the same year. We were in the same commencement exercises at UNM, getting our degrees, and he got his in general education. So he wasn't like pounding away to get a science or physics degree. He was pounding away to show us that you keep going in school, and keep doing good work. And so he did good work, and that was an important model for me. Doing that work that was not just the science that he was interested in, which is like my content area, my area of expertise is children's books, but also doing everything you can with what you have to help other Native people. So he worked at the lab to try to get things fairer for Pueblo people that were working there. And he started an engineering program at UNM, the Native American program in the College of Engineering. NAPCO is what it was called. So he got that going at UNM. And he was also one of the founders of the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. So my dad did a lot in lots and lots of ways, and he was a good model for me in that. Don't give up, and don't let anyone think that you are not as good as they are, because I think that was a piece of what he struggled with himself, is that he was working alongside PhDs from Yale and Harvard, and he had a bachelor's of curriculum studies at UNM, and that was tough. I know that was tough because he talked about it. The ways that these power differentials kind of play into your life and can hurt you, but keep going, pretty much, is one of my big takeaways from my dad.
I think one of the interesting things that I read was he wrote 150 articles.
Yes, he did.
Were they all science?
They are, and it's an interesting experience that he and I share, that he would pull out those articles with such joy, and he wanted someone in the family to be able to read them. But they were technical. They're very scientific and technical writings, and you'd need a lot of training to be able to understand what he did. And I try, and he tried to explain it to us. And so in my writing, on my blog, the writing that I think is the most influential is staying away from jargon as much as possible, staying away from that academic writing, because my dad would say, eyes glass over when he was talking, and I try really hard not to speak or write in a way where the audience that I'm trying to reach, that their eyes will do that. They'll just go.
He also had patents.
Yes.
On things. What kinds of things was he doing?
He was developing cameras. The kind of camera science that he did was cameras that would take pictures very, very quickly. He would be angry at me for saying it that way, because that's not technically correct. But he was working for Los Alamos National Laboratory as a physicist, designing cameras that would take pictures of atomic explosions. So he was in the weapons program, and they needed to evaluate the bombs, where they were strong and where they were weak, and you needed cameras to record that. So that's what he did. He designed those cameras, And because he was working for a government agency for the lab, he could not patent those things himself. So the lab got the patents on those, and he got a little letter from the lab and a $1 bill. That was how they were doing it. And so in my mom's house, there's a photograph of his $1 bill and his patent.
That's a great story.
It is. It is.
We discussed earlier your view. You have quite an academic. Your academic credentials are very interesting and well regarded in the academy. We discussed earlier your views on the academy, especially for American Indian faculty. What was your experience there?
Well, I went to graduate school at the University of Illinois with the intention of coming back here once I got that PhD. My husband and I both went together to continue working at the Indian School in Santa Fe, which is where we met, or to start a school that would work very closely with the kids up at Nambe Pueblo. As it was, the University of Illinois had a mascot, and it did not have an American Indian Studies program. And so being there, it was a place that was in desperate need of change. So I worked very hard there for many years to get that mascot eventually gone, and to create a Native Studies program and a house for Native students, because there was also no services for Native students there. So we created the Native Studies program there. I was the first hire in that program, and we were trying to create a program that was similar to what I experienced as a Pueblo person, in that we don't have these tiers of who knows more. We're all here together as a people of a community. We all have something to contribute. And the way that universities are structured, they usually have all the power is in the professor part, where the academics take place. Students are just kind of there to pay the professors' salaries. They do learn, but that is a big piece, is that they fund the work that a university does. So they have very little power. Students and the people that take care of students have very little power in university. And at Illinois, we were trying to create a program where students would be protected by our power as faculty. So we created a unit that was one unit, not one that had the students over in a student support area. They were part of the academic unit. But that's unusual, because that means that we would have a bigger role to play in terms of the students that came to the school, which I was very excited about. I thought that was important. And we started hiring people to be faculty there who didn't quite have that same commitment to community or working with students. And there are times when I'm angry at that, because I was just raised that way so strongly, that we take care of each other and we help each other. And this goes back to being a kid in the kiva, where we would be in there, and before we would go out, they would tell us that we're dancing and it's like praying, and and it's not for us, and so don't go praying for yourself. You pray for our people here, but you also pray for all the people out there too, because we all need help. So that was an important piece of what I learned as a very young child, is that everything I do is for everybody. It's not about me. And that's not what the universities are about. The universities are about professors making a name and becoming famous, and making money for universities. So a professor that gets hired who is really trying to do that has to, by choice, unfortunately, turn away from students and showing up to help students with this, and showing up at student events, or taking students to the doctor if they need help. They don't do that. And so our program kind of went from one that I wanted to see as community-centered to one that was more like the rest of the university. Mm-hmm. And the faculty voted to separate, to send the student component back over to the student services arm of the university. And that was my first warning, I guess, that things were not going to go well. And the next year, I was not reappointed to university, because I was really, according to the university's framework. I was spending too much time with students, working with teachers, working with librarians, doing what I was taught to do at home, working with people, not being selfish enough to work on my own kinds of things that would get me quote unquote tenure and bring grant money to the university. I wasn't doing that. So that's the political nature of university, and I made a decision, and I knew it was likely going to end up that way, and I don't regret that. That's the way it turned out. And so I was not reappointed. I went on to get a Master's of Library Science. I was already a well-known person in the field of children's literature, and that just has continued to grow. Without a university position, I have lots of freedom to travel, lots of time to think and research and write. And so I do that. And in terms of my profile as a Native scholar, it's pretty good. And ironically, it's the kind of thing that universities want. But anyway, I'm quite happy doing what I do.
What drives your activism?
Okay, what drives my activism is two things. I did well in school. I learned to read. I knew who I was. I knew who we were. And when I saw stereotypes in children's books, it was like water off my back. It didn't matter. I had plenty of strength from my community and from my family. So it didn't hurt me. But that wasn't the case, I know, for a lot of other people. The research points to how hard it is for our kids to get through school. The research shows that Native kids drop out of school at higher rates than anybody else. Native people commit suicide at higher rates than anybody else. And when you step back at that and look at this society and what this society is giving to us once we're not in our community, there's a lot. And children's books are part of that. They hurt. People in children's literature get very excited. People in general get very excited. They talk about the book that shaped their life. And I think, yes, that's a good thing. But there's a lot of books out there that beat us up. And I don't want little kids to keep getting beat up by the books that their teachers hand to them. So what drives me is thinking about little kids and the books that they are being asked to read by their teachers. I want them to have better choices. And that means that people have to stop thinking of us in the stereotypical ways they do. Mascots feed that thinking. Bad writing, like in really popular books like Little House on the Prairie. There's a lot of Indians in that book. They're not real, they're stereotypes. But all of these things, they're just like starting in board books and picture books and chapter books and easy readers and novels. It's just like it's a ladder of pain when you look carefully at all of that. So what drives me is the faces of little kids, the experiences my daughter had in school and her cousins and Native kids.
Well, that segues into, you're one of the few people that we've interviewed that has boarding school teaching experience. And I know you taught at Anadarko and then at Santa Fe Indian School. Can you tell us a little bit about each and how you perceive them?
Yeah. So my parents went to Santa Fe, to the boarding school in Santa Fe. I went to Pewaukee High School. By the time that I was old enough to go to the high school, people at Nambe were sending kids mostly to Pewaukee High School. And it was during that time period when things were getting kind of wild in the school. So Santa Fe Indian School wasn't like the best place to go. Lots of drinking, lots of drugs, not just there, but everywhere. And parents wanted us home so they could keep a better eye on us. Anyway, so Santa Fe Indian School figures in our family very prominently. And I taught at Anadarko in I guess the 80s. I went to get a master's degree at Norman at the University of Oklahoma. And I was teaching at Anadarko at Riverside Indian School. And it was a government boarding school. But all of the kids who were there because they couldn't be home, because their home lives were very disrupted. So we had kids from all over the country. There were some kids always stay in your heart and in your head. There was a couple from Florida. They were Miccosukee kids, and they were cute as could be, a second and a third grader, and cute as could be, and they knew how to charm pizza money out of the secretaries and out of the teachers. But that charm had come from having to learn how to navigate a system that was not kind to them and their family. So they were there as little tiny kids at the boarding school in Anadarko. And there was lots of troubled kids and lots of things not going well. And I was there as a chapter 1 math teacher, and I didn't do a whole lot of math teaching. I did a lot of just being with kids and taking them fishing and doing things like that, kind of providing them with some warmth that I think was lacking for them there at the school. So Anadarko was hard. Kids didn't do well. Lots of things didn't go well. And then I moved back home and started teaching at Santa Fe Indian School. And that was just amazing. It was, by then, had been under the control of AIPC for several years and had started winning awards for the Pueblo-centric kinds of work that was going on there. So it was a wonderful place to teach, and kids were excited and interested, and I could say a lot more about certain things there. I guess we can talk about that, but some of the things that matter when you are a Pueblo teacher or a Native teacher working with Pueblo or Native kids is that there's an understanding of what you can talk about because you know who you are, both you and the kids. And that happened one time at the Indian School in Santa Fe. There are more Native teachers at Santa Fe Indian School than you'll find at most other schools. Anyway, so something had happened at one of the Pueblos, and the kids were I don't want to say afraid, but there was some tension about what had happened, and they like me knew you don't talk about that stuff. And basically, you don't talk about this stuff with white people. Don't tell your teachers. It was one of the things that I was raised with. Well, here we were in my classroom there at the Indian School, and they really wanted to talk, and one of them started to talk, and one of them said, "No, we can't talk," and another one said, "Wait, she's Pueblo." And so we were off. And those kind of moments don't happen in public schools, and those kind of things don't happen when you don't have Native teachers in the classrooms. So our kids, in that example, these kids could be who they are with a person in authority, a teacher, and that doesn't happen very often.
And the sense of empowerment that must have come from that instance of knowing who they were and who you were.
And the freedom that they had. It was quite, I think.
Well, there's another interesting story about your time at Santa Fe Indian School, and that's meeting your husband. Can you tell us his name and
his name's George.
Met?
His name's George. George Reese is a white guy from Pennsylvania who went to St. John's College in Annapolis, taught troubled kids in Chicago, then decided he wanted to get a teaching degree that was being offered through St. John's here in Santa Fe and the University of New Mexico. So he moved out here and took that degree and taught in Santa Fe public schools, and then we both ended up at the Indian School in Santa Fe. And the principal at the time was interested in the outdoor education program. Was one of those where you take kids out mountain climbing and doing ropes training and all of that. Anyway, so I was on the middle school team. He was on the high school team, and there we go. It was lots of Pueblo. It was the stories of that first outing are lots of fun because there were Pueblo people, and then there were the white teachers that were also part of that, and the mountaineering people from the Santa Fe Institute. They were white, of course, and that first night. I'm sorry, I'm not following quite the story, but that first night, it was cold. It was October, and so we were up in Pecos Wilderness, and it was cold. And these Santa Fe mountaineering people were like, no fires, because that's bad for the environment. And so they had one candle, and all of us Pueblo people are looking at each other like, this is messed up. and the next day, the guys, they said, tonight we're having a fire. So we had a fire. But anyway, in the daytimes, we were doing these trainings, and my husband and I were on the same team. He wasn't my husband that I didn't even know who he was, that he was just this guy on the high school team. But we were doing the mountain rappelling part of that, where you have to come down off a high cliff and then climb back up. And he was on my team, and I was really afraid, and I was coming down, and he was the one feeding the rope to help me. I forgot what his actual name was when you have that role. Anyway, that's how I met my husband, was on that training. And and so we fell in love, and the kids, they loved it. The students at the Indian school were like, look, there's our teachers. And they like to call out to us and tease us a little bit because we were so clearly in love.
And you have an amazing daughter.
Yeah, we do.
And can you talk a little bit about her and her accomplishments?
Yeah, I can do that. Her name is Elizabeth. Her Tewa name is Yampovi, and she uses that a lot. She is, she's very determined and very smart. When we took her to Illinois with us when we went to graduate school, and that was tough, being so far from her cousins, who she had spent her first years with. Being away from them was hard. And anyway, she's smart, and she graduated from a gifted school in Illinois when she was 16 and went to Yale and got a degree in political science at Yale, and then went to the United Kingdom to study at Cambridge for a year and got a master's in philosophy. And then she came back here to Harvard and got a law degree at Harvard. So she's doing all these things as a young person, and I'm very proud of her stick-to-itness also. And I think that's also my dad, my dad's influence on her. And she would come home in the summers and stay with my mom and dad up there and talk with them a lot. It was always interesting because my dad and I would like butt heads a lot about certain things, and so Liz would want to get Dad's story about that. But anyway, she's currently working as a clerk for a judge in Chicago. She did a year as an intern for the National Congress of American Indians, and a year knocking on doors all over Alabama getting testimony for people whose votes had been suppressed. So she's very much an activist herself.
Yeah, that's a whole family of activists.
Yeah.
A long line of activists, a great legacy for your family.
Yeah.
So you leave the university and you go independent. What gave you the idea to begin the blog American Indians in Children's Literature? What did you see was the need?
Well, when I in the 90s, a form of communication started, and I'm saying it that way because I think a lot of young people really don't know what that was in the 90s because nobody uses email listservs anymore. But that was the thing. That was the way that scholars were talking to each other a lot, beyond conferences or beyond in-person meetings. There were email listservs, and so there were a lot of them in children's literature. And I was very active in about 8 or 9 of them because they were some for middle school and some for high school and some for writers and some for editors, and I was like, I'm going to all of them. And so I was very active in all of them, but I was repeating myself across these listservs. And then this new technology developed, and those were blogs. And so I thought, okay, I can combine everything I'm doing over here and then send the link to the blog to all these places, and I don't have to have these many conversations going on. So I started blogging for many reasons. That was one. But another was that my daughter Liz had gone away for the first time for that summer, and it was anguish. She's my only child, and so having her away for the whole summer was tough. That's when she was 13. And so I needed something to really help me, focus, keep myself from worrying. So that's the year I launched the blog. So it helped me get through a difficult, lonely period without my daughter. But it was also a realization that I was publishing a lot. I was already working as an assistant professor. And I was publishing a lot of articles that teachers couldn't read. Because in order to read these articles that I was publishing, you had to be a member of the National Council of Teachers of English, or one of the many associations. And I thought, this is no good. This is no good. Teachers need this information. So that was the other thing that the blog let me do. It was let me speak to the world. All anybody needed was internet access, and they could read what I was doing, what I was writing. And that's been the most useful way for me to spend any of my time, is working on that blog.
You talked about professional journals and
Yeah.
professional organizations. How do they shut out the public?
The way it costs money to be a member of those associations. So in order for you to be a member of NCTE, and I don't know what it is now, but they're $40 or $50 to join, and once you join, then you get the journals that come to your house. But then you have to find time to read them, and teacher time is very little. I know that because I taught here at Pewaukee for several years. And time to do all of the professional development, that was precious. No dollars to join and no time for that. So shorter articles on a blog that were free allowed for greater sharing of things that I wanted to share. The other thing about conferences that's always been there but was very clear to me in November, the National Council of Teachers of English had their big annual conference, and 2018 was a year when quite a lot more native writers got published than has been the case before. People who are my peers in the academy say that's partly because of your work on the blog. People are paying attention to what you say, they're looking for this kind of thing, and so we're seeing an uptick in publishing of native writers, and we're also seeing a drop in books by white people who don't know what they're talking about. Editors are learning, okay, this is a risk if I do this because Debbie might see it and it will get critiqued and not do well. So anyway, people have told me they think that the blog is doing that work, and that's very affirming to me. But so this was a year, 2018 was a year for native writers, and so I didn't go to NCTE because I can't afford to join, and the disappointing realization for me was there wasn't a single native writer invited to speak at the conference, and none of the panelists that were there, and there were hundreds of papers being presented, not a single one of them was about a native writer. I thought, wow, why would a native teacher go there? Was a native teacher there? I don't know, and I'm tapping people I know in education to see if they had any native teachers that might be in their networks that had gone to that. But anyway, these places are still very shut to native people, and though we're making some gains in books being published, clearly we have a lot of work to do.
What are the most important aspects or criteria that you use in reviews and literary criticism?
Well, one is I don't say literary, because I think that when we use that kind of a word, we automatically give a white framework status that it doesn't deserve. That means that you're supposed to speak this way, and if you don't, then it's not really well written. Which means that the native cadence with which we speak here would get looked down upon. So I don't use that word literary, and I encourage my colleagues, I say, who made that rule? When they're trying to talk about literary, I say, whose rule are you following? And does that serve your community for you to use that rule? So I don't use that word, and the first thing I look for is who wrote this book. And I'm very interested in native writers, and so I know kind of who's writing. And I also know, because I am part of an academic native network, I know about fraud, I know about academic fraud, I know about people who are claiming to be native when they're not. So I kind of have a way of doing the background work to see who is writing and what's coming. So looking for who the writers are, who the illustrators are, is the first thing that I do. And the second thing is the word nation in there anywhere? Is that writer presenting a book that grounds our nationhood, our sovereignty? Because that is the single most important piece of who we are. We're all here now because Popeye and all of our ancestors fought for us to remain on our own homelands with our own ways intact, and we can carry that on, but we have to take care to carry it on.
I know in our discussions and in also some of the readings that I've done with you or on you, you talk significantly about the difference between distinct minorities, misrepresentation of indigenous people. What do you mean by that?
In the 90s, when there was another wave of attention on the fact that we the people means lots of different people. It doesn't mean just white people. So that was when the word multicultural started to appear in academic writings and textbooks and things. And there would be an African American column, and an Asian column, and a Latino column, and a Native column. Now the single most important attribute for who we are is our nationhood. There could be no grid for nationhood in that kind of a structure. So one of the things that I did learn that was really important when I was working on the faculty in American Indian Studies at Illinois is that the place that we ought to be aligned in people's thinking is not as a culture, but as nations. So at a university, instead of housing a Native Studies program with ethnic studies, it's most accurately placed with international studies, because we are talking about sovereign nations who all have jurisdictions and the rights to say what will go on their homelands. So nationhood and sovereignty is something that I look for pretty strongly. And it's very important to me that people understand that when they look at me, they see darker skin and darker hair, and they say, oh yeah, that's a native, that's an Indian person because she's got dark hair and dark skin. I say no.
And jewelry.
And the jewelry. And I say no. That doesn't matter. What we look like is not the important thing. It is our particular nation and how our particular nations have determined that we would be a citizen of that nation. You could be mixed race with a father who's African American and a mother who is Pueblo. Doesn't matter. You're not half Nambe. You're 100% a citizen of Nambe. Doesn't matter what you look like. What matters is the rules that Nambe has made to make that kind of determination. So that's a big one. That's a really important one that the society, American society, really needs to understand, because we have that kind of creeping up all over the place. Recently we had it with the Indian Child Welfare Act and the child who was being taken, the Choctaw child, who was being taken from her foster family to be placed with her Choctaw relatives. And people said, oh, but she's only like 0.9999 Choctaw. And we're like, no, she is Choctaw. Doesn't matter what she looks like. What matters is that she is a citizen of the Choctaw Nation. And so appearance and understanding that appearance is not the determining factor of what our nations and citizens or tribal memberships are about is a huge learning that has to happen in American society.
I think along with that, the distinction between minorities and indigenous cultures is also, you feel that literature provides both a political and diplomatic relationship for indigenous readers.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I think that in the United States today, most kids learn about city government, and they learn about state government, and they learn about federal government. But they don't learn that this nation was found, that we predate all of these kinds of governments. Native nations and our governments were here long before theirs were. That has to be a part of their learning, because those treaties, those relationships depends, because there's over 500 tribes and we all have different relationships with what we now call the United States government. Some of us predate even the United States because we had relationships with Mexico and with Spain, the Pueblos did. Kids need to know that, because if you're driving too fast on Pueblo land, you're going to get pulled over. You have to pay a ticket for driving too fast. And you don't pay that to the state of New Mexico, you pay that to a tribal government. And I think kids need to know that. I think American citizens need to know that. Because it's a piece of who this place is all about, this country that we call the United States.
And learning to be diplomatic about who they are in terms of diplomacy and actions within the community.
Well, I think that one of the ways that diplomacy matters, that kind of conversations that need to happen between heads of state, play into the well-being of our nations today. That when someone from a particular nation says X, Y, and Z is not okay, and here's why, the hearer of those words can say, oh, right, I get it, I understand. Because a lot of the way that people think is that we're just cultures, and that they don't know we have that power. And we do, and that power has a lot of meaning.
How do publishers, authors, teachers have an opportunity to provide students with critical thinking skills using your blog?
Oh, that's a fun part of my blog, is taking a sentence that is in a book and saying, this is how this sentence could be improved. There's a lot of nonfiction that comes out that is where, these are nonfiction picture books for kids that will have First Americans on the title, or that will have that as a subtitle. And what you can do with a book like that, what a teacher can do with a book like that, is hold it up, get a Sharpie and say, no, and cross out Americans. Because the native peoples who were here before this place became the United States of America, we're not Americans. We were who we were before America became America. So being able to tell a teacher, for a teacher to be able to use that book cover and the pages in the book to show a child that books have mistakes in them and you can write in them, because these, if you own them, if it's your own book, you can write in it. If it's a library book, you get in trouble for doing that. But I do advocate, I do recommend that librarians and teachers model that when there is a book that has a mistake in it, they can mark it somehow, because then someone else will learn from that marking that books make mistakes. Because people treat books with like they're sacred, and they're not. They're just words on paper. They're not sacred. The content that is being conveyed, the ideas that are being conveyed, that's what is important. And we can play with that.
I liked what you said about teachers using books as, for example, First Americans, to go to the map and say, these were settled areas, or, these people belonged here, things like that. That they can use it as, not just a cultural sensitivity lesson, but as an academic curriculum lesson.
Yeah, and when I advocate for Native writers, like one writer that I talk about a lot, because she's got picture books and chapter books and young adult novels, is Cynthia Lytic Smith. She's Muskogee Creek. We need a Pueblo, Cynthia Lytic Smith, that's doing work like she does, because her book Jingle Dancer shows a little girl. It's the book that I wish that I had when my little girl was dancing for the first time, when she danced bow and arrow at home for the first time, because I made a book for her. We just drew pictures and made a homemade book for her about that. But Jingle Dancer came out in 2000, and it's about a little girl who's going to do the jingle dance for the first time, and how she goes to all her grandmas, her aunties, and they all help her. She's trying to help get enough jingles for her dress, and she visits all these community women, and they help her get ready. And in her house, so she's also learning how to do the dance, and her grandma has a video, a TV and a video of someone doing a jingle dancer. So it's like wonderful, because so many people think that, well, Indians live in teepees, right? They don't have electricity, right? Wrong! And this book conveys all of that. And she's going down the street in her jeans and tennis shoes, and when she's learning the dance, and then when she's doing the dance, it's precisely what we do when we're dancing. We're in a reflective state as we dance and thinking about everybody. And one of her aunties tells her, they'll talk about what they want her to think of. So Jingle Dancer does that, and I wished I had it when my daughter was dancing. But now my daughter's a lawyer, and in the book there is a character. This is an interesting story too. I could get going on the content of children's books, but a lot of publishers will reject a book because the character in it doesn't seem like a real person to them, because they have these wrong ideas about what we can be. So in this particular book, there's a character who is a lawyer, and she's got her briefcase, and she can't go to the powwow because she has a big case coming up, and she can't go. That is exactly what happens to so many of us. That's what's happening with my daughter right now as a lawyer. There are times when she can't come home. So this book reflects so beautifully a community of people who want to be together, who do be together, but who sometimes can't be together, because we're not all living at home. Some of us are other places doing other things. So anyway.
That's a great example. And speaking of examples, the mascot was not your only controversy that you engaged in, with some very interesting people, and that was the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award.
Yeah.
That is a story we'd like to hear.
Okay. All right. So one of the books that has misshaped how people think about Native people forever is Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House on the Prairie. It's got the family moving into Indian territory, and the way that the book is written, it acts like there was nobody there except these handful of Indians. And in fact, there were a lot of people in there. It was already Indian territory. Cherokees had already been there for a long time, building seminaries, building towns and banks and schools, and they weren't running around half naked. That's the way Native people are shown in that book. So it's factually wrong, but teachers use it across the country at third grade level, because that's when you start teaching historical fiction, is third grade. So at third grade, teachers use that book. So that's one of the ones that I've pushed on very, very hard. Every time I speak, everything I write, I'm always talking about Little House on the Prairie, because I think that book is doing a lot of harm. In fact, I think it's one of the reasons there's so many people in the country today wanting to make America great again, because they're thinking about this time period that never existed. So I've worked very hard on that, and sometime last year or maybe the year before, I learned that the American Library Association's Services to Children arm was going to have a meeting. They wanted to retire the name of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, an award that they give to a writer for the body of their work. It was named after her. She's the first one that got the award. They wanted to rename it because they recognized that their commitment, the American Library Association's commitment to diversity, and this award name don't go together anymore. They never did, but the realization was growing, the understanding was growing. So when I heard they were going to do that, I was like, oh, that's nice of you. It'll never happen. And I was very snarky about it, and snarky based on all the conversations I'd had with hundreds of teachers. It upsets me every time I think about talking to teachers and saying, can you please imagine my daughter sitting next to you and you're reading The Only Good Indian is a Dead Indian to her? Can you imagine? Can you do that? Yeah, because that's harm to a Native child. Anyway, I didn't know how much a difference that was making in the American Library Association, and it was part of why they wanted to revisit that name. I was surprised and thrilled, and still didn't think it was going to happen. So in July, when they were having their annual meeting and they were going to vote on it, I made sure to go to that conference and go to that meeting. And I walked into the room. It was a large conference room, and seated around the table were all the voting members of that body. And I looked at them, they're all white women, and I thought, forget it. It's just not going to happen. Nice try, but not going to happen. And they had a good conversation about it, and they voted to change it. And they voted to change it immediately. That event was another oh my gosh, I cannot believe this. It was so affirming. I felt wonderful that so much, we weren't going in little steps, we were going big, giant steps, and that was terrific. And they did, sure enough. I walked out of that meeting and went to my computer and pulled up that page. The name was changed! And they had a note of explanation. So I did have a bigger role in that than I realized. I was learning that along the way.
What did they rename it?
Oh, it's the Children's Literature Legacy Award.
Okay. And you also had some controversy with William Shatner.
I did.
Around that issue.
People were very unhappy about that. There's lots and lots of writings online. People were objecting to that, you being politically correct. And I'm saying, no, I'm a teacher. We're talking about accuracy here. This is just wrong, factually wrong, the content of this book. But people have a fondness for that book. And one of them was William Shatner, and he tweeted something about that. And pretty soon, a lot of Native people were tweeting at him and trying to talk to him, but he was having none of it. he was blocking Native people left and right, and I ended up writing about that for the Guardian newspaper, about key people who really, it's funny because that's Captain Kirk. He's supposed to be progressive hero in some ways, but no.
The final frontier guy.
But when we go back and look at that frontier, okay, let's think about this.
Yeah. Well, I found that very interesting. It's just how emotional he was about it. Part
of that work too led the association to name me as the recipient of a big award that they give. So I'll receive the Arbuthnot Award in April. And when word started to filter along the internet that I had been selected for that, and when they told me, I said, I don't know if you want to give it to me, because a lot of people don't like what I do. And they said, oh no, we want to give it to you. And when they announced it at the conference, they called me and they said, did you hear everybody cheering? Because people were very excited that I had, people didn't know, it was a secret. People didn't know they were going to name me. Anyway, so they did, but the people that don't like what I do launched a campaign. There was like a change.org petition, take that award away from Debbie Reese. She doesn't deserve it. Interesting.
Take the good with the bad.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
You talked about students and children being able to see a mirror when they read. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So I have to look up the year because I'm at the moment not drawing it to my mind, but an African American scholar in children's literature named Rudine Sims Bishop developed this idea that books can function like mirrors, that when you read a book, it reflects your own experience, or it can be a window so that you can look onto somebody else's experience. So books as windows and mirrors is an idea that has really taken a lot of traction. It's really being used a lot in children's literature. People who track publication numbers and what we find in books generate data. And one of my former students worked with a team of people to create an infographic that shows what we see when we're looking at that data. So in the graphic, half of it shows a white boy, and all around him are mirrors. Lots of mirrors. Pretty ones, little ones, shiny ones, all kinds of mirrors. And he's standing there looking around, like wherever he looks, there's a mirror. And next to him is a rabbit looking in a mirror, because unfortunately, there's a lot of books about rabbits. And the other half of the graphic shows an African American child, and a Latino child, and an Asian American child. All of them have less mirrors than the rabbit. And at the far end is a native child. And the native child is holding a tiny little hand mirror. That's all she has, is one little mirror. And that particular graphic represents the year 2015, when 0.9% of the books that came out that year had native content in them. So her mirror is tiny. But what I do, so they do the count. What I do is read all those 0.9% books. And when I look at them, that includes books with stereotypes in them. So the number gets even smaller. So not only is her mirror tiny, but it's cracked. It's not a good mirror, because the reflection of a native experience is very, very tiny. So the graphic that represents all of that is really stunning. Yeah. People are really surprised when they see it displayed that way.
And more people should see that.
Yeah. I show that graphic everywhere. And she's Dr. Sarah Park-Dolan is my student, and she's going to do a graphic again this year with this year's data.
Great.
So very, very tiny growth in it.
With your role as an advocate for children, what concerns you the most about Indigenous youth today?
There's a lot of writing, a lot of concern that kids are not reading. But I think that people have said that forever. I think if we tracked the literature, we would find that people, my grandma probably said that. People have been saying that for a long time. The kids aren't reading like they used to. And probably there are some studies that demonstrate that does happen. The internet certainly has had an impact on that. Kids and their cell phones or technology, their devices, does take time away from when they might have been reading. But I think kids who are going to read anyway, whether they're reading on a Kindle or a regular book. My concern is that we still don't have enough books for Native kids that reflect their lives or the lives of I'm Pueblo. I would like to have books that accurately reflect Pueblo life. But Muskogee life is good too, because we have shared experiences historically. There are culturally some things that are the same, like grandma's helping kids when they're going to dance for the first time. So non-Native kids, the air that they breathe sustains them just because it's the way it is. I want that for Native kids too, because I think sadly people say, well, can you prove to me that it's going to make a difference to a Native kid to have a book that looks like them? I say no, and why do we have to prove that? You didn't have to prove it for white people. There's some interesting power pushbacks on the calls for Native writing to get published. But I'd like to see that happen in big numbers. I'd really like major writers, and they do. That's one of the benefits of my blog, is that big writers will say, Debbie was right, I should not have used low man on the totem pole. And I'm taking that out of my next printing of my book. So that's important because it's knowledge that's spreading, and spreading in a way that's clearing the air, making the air that Native kids breathe better.
I also wonder about students finding mentors, and how would you advise young people to do that?
How would I advise Native kids to find mentors? Are we talking about college or?
No, just someone who is supportive, who, like the grandmas in the Jingle Book, or what are students not doing that is keeping them from finding mentors?
I don't think it's students not finding mentors. I think a lot of it is adults not creating those spaces for kids. I think that part of what happens, unfortunately, is that the way that American society is structured, Native adults make choices that aren't necessarily in the best interests of little kids needing models. Sometimes they don't have a choice because of the way the system is set up. They don't have that time. So I think part of it is really on the adults finding ways. And as soon as I say that, I want to unsay it because it blames Native people for a system that we didn't create. Mm-hmm. But we are in that system and trying to navigate that system in ways that help build our young. Has to happen more.
And I'm thinking more in terms of like your father, who, these engineering affiliations, the societies, the Boy Scouts, those are very important and key people in a community that often get overlooked as mentors. So I wanted to ask that question. And finally, what advice would you give to young people today?
Don't give up. Keep going. We do get knocked down. We do. And it hurts sometimes, really bad. We do get hurt, but take time, drink water, and come back. Give yourself that time to find that space again, to come back and keep going. My dad did that, and I'm doing that. I know that a lot of people, when you lose a position at a university, a lot of people kind of, that's it. But I found a way to keep going.
There's life and freedom.
There's life and freedom, and it's pretty good.
Well, thank you. And is there anything we haven't asked you that you would like to talk about?
Yeah, there is. I talked about the mirror in the window, and a piece that I have added to that is the idea of a curtain. And I brought that out to the conversations in literature when I was trying to do a workshop presentation that showed a mirror and a window. I was looking for a Pueblo home with a window that I could use to represent myself, and I was clicking around on the internet, and I came to our kiva. There was a picture of our kiva in our community house with a curtain. And I know why that curtain is there. And I thought, oh, right, curtains. We have mirrors, we have windows, and we have curtains because there are things that we do that nobody needs to know about. And we protect that knowledge. And we in the Pueblos really protect that. Other nations don't have those same kinds of things. And it was going east and learning that other people do things in more public spaces than we do here. It made me very nervous. I was very anxious when I saw that. You're not supposed to do that in public. But other nations are different. Other tribes do things differently. But anyway, all nations have things that we protect. And so I've introduced to the conversations in literature, the idea that we draw curtains on certain things because we want to protect certain things from misunderstandings that ultimately hurt us. The reason that those curtains are there are because of those anthropologists that were around here in the 1800s misrepresenting what we were doing, that led the government to try to stop us from dancing, trying to stop us from being native. So curtains are really important, and there are ways that a native writer can talk about spirituality or ceremony without showing that ceremony or that spirituality. They can note in the writing that it exists and that it supports them, but they don't have to give step-by-step instructions on how to do that. And so I'm working really hard on that.
I think that's a great visual.
Yeah.
To think about, there's sacred knowledge, there's sacred wisdom, and that it pertains to certain people. Yeah. And they have a right.
Absolutely. And the literature world will come at you, well, you're trying to censor what someone can say. And I say, no, I'm not. Every library has pieces in it that the public doesn't have access to. Mm-hmm. Donors provide archived materials that say this can't be shared until X, Y, and Z. So everybody shares and holds private certain things. We do too. That ought to be respected. And the other piece that I also need to mention is that our stories are sacred stories. They're not folk tales, they're not fairy tales, and categorizing them that way, and many people do. In many libraries you'll find native creation stories over in the folk and fairy tale section. So teachers think that they can use them like a folk or fairy tale, and they can't. So I talk about that a lot when I'm working with librarians. Move those native traditional stories over to the Jesus stories, because we're talking about sacred stories. They're not to be played with. Playing with sacred stories is sacrilege, and you don't do it to Christian stories. You should not do it to native stories. And the way to get that across is to move native creation stories over to the shelf of world religions where they belong. Or if you're going to call ours folk and fairy, move those ones over to the folk and fairy tale shelf too. Makes it's an easy understanding. Mm-hmm. Read my blog. I want everybody to read my blog. It's called American Indians and Children's Literature.
We've been reading it. So thanks so much for making the time for us. I know you're on a break here with your family, and we wish you the best and safe travels.
Thank you.